Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis, a breaking news reporter here at Forbes. Joining me now is Forbes contributor Ben Koltun. Ben, I want you to provide us an update on a conversation we've been having really since the beginning of February, which is all about the debt ceiling. On Monday night, President Biden and House Speaker Kevin McCarthy met to discuss the debt limit. Where are we on these negotiations?
Yes. So Washington, D.C. is certainly asserting its prerogative to be the center of the universe with the debate over raising the debt ceiling, and especially in the last few days. If there are two words I would say to describe the current state of talks, I'd say it's optimism and drama. So first, the optimism. As we've seen over the past couple of days, President Biden and Speaker McCarthy are both genuinely interested in reaching a deal. And the reason why is that at this juncture of the negotiations, there is no real alternative besides a negotiated solution. Democratic talks of Biden invoking the 14th Amendment to bypass the debt ceiling, or through the discharge petition to bypass House leadership on the floor, it's unfeasible, and there's not enough time, and there's too many complications to be completed in time. And Biden and McCarthy know there is political backlash to a default. And another reason why there's optimism is that there are serious negotiators involved. Both Biden and McCarthy have deputized aides and allies who are more workhorses rather than show horses in DC, with experience in bipartisan negotiations. And finally, there is a forcing mechanism of the X date when the government can't pay all of its obligations. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen on Monday reiterated that the X date is highly likely to come in early June, with a possibility as soon as June 1st. And there's been some independent analysis to back that up. If that's the case, that June 1st is really the time where action needs to be made, a deal and legislation in order to get through the House and the Senate needs to be made by this Sunday. And so that really has put an impetus on both sides to kind of come to the talking and to the negotiating table. At the same time, as there's optimism, there's plenty of drama. So Biden and McCarthy are essentially in an escape room of policy issues. There are a lot of challenging puzzles to make to find a deal that can pass the Republican-led House, the Democratic-led Senate, and be signed by Biden. And any deal involves compromise that will leave both sides unhappy. And so that's what you're seeing today. They go back and forth between optimism from McCarthy and pessimism about the specifics of the deal. Because both sides, they want a deal, they want to avoid a default, but they also want to preserve their jobs. And this is as much a political fight as it is a policy one. If DC was serious about reducing the debt, there would be talks about entitlement reform and revenue measures on the table, but that's not the case. It's about, for this debt ceiling fight, it's about protecting one's own spending and tax policy priorities at the expense of the other parties. And we're kind of seeing that right now with the lack of progress over current talks. Still, with kind of the optimism in trying to get to yes, I'd never underestimate the creativity and budget maneuvers to reach a deal where both sides can declare victory. And I think that's something that we'll see in the days ahead as there's more crunch time towards the X date.
Optimism and drama. I couldn't have boiled it down better myself. We'll talk about the drama in a little bit, but first, let's set our sights on the optimism. McCarthy really sounded more hopeful he has in the past 24 hours than he has in recent weeks. In recent weeks, he said it seemed that Biden Democrats wanted a default rather than a deal, but now he says that there's a sense that he sees a light at the end of the tunnel here. So how should we, as the American people, be feeling right now?
Yes, I'd say optimism is warranted. That's because we've kind of gone through we've removed the talking points from McCarthy and Biden from a few weeks ago. Biden is at the negotiating table. There is a lack of alternatives for Democrats to take unilateral action. And there's a recognition that McCarthy is much stronger than he appeared to be earlier in this year in the minds of Democrats. And so we've seen kind of the Democrats move from no negotiations over the debt ceiling to negotiations. It's from raising spending that was in Biden's FY 2024 budget proposal to proposing a freeze in spending. There is some openings on work requirements. There is an opening on rescinding unspent COVID aid. There's a lot of things that are on the table that you can see some sort of compromise. And that's why I think there's a reason for optimism here. is that Biden recognizes he does need to make a deal with McCarthy, and McCarthy realizes that Biden is coming to the table and that there is a path forward. Now, getting to that path involves more drama, involves maybe more heartburn in the market, and involves kind of some more political will from both sides. But I think both sides are kind of in agreement that a deal needs to be reached, and they are working in good faith to get there.
Both sides are literally at the table. Both sides say they want a deal. But as right now, as you and I are sitting here, we're dangerously close to June 1st, early June, which Janet Yellen has again expressed. This is the X date. This is the hard deadline by early June. So what are these areas that you're a little more pessimistic on? What are these areas where there's an impasse where both sides can't compromise?
Yes. So I think it's just like looking at these dynamics is that the challenge here, and the really challenging puzzle, is that you have to pass something that gets through the Republican-led House and the Democratic-led Senate. And both Biden and McCarthy, they are concerned about preserving their jobs almost as much as they are about raising the debt ceiling. For McCarthy, it's about upsetting his base of a lot of kind of far-right conservatives who gave McCarthy a run for his money for Speaker. And then for Biden, he's running for re-election, and he doesn't want to upset his base of progressive supporters who will be instrumental for any re-election. And so it's with this in mind, it's just they have to bridge the gap. There's a big bid-ask spread here on the actual specifics of a deal. So take, for instance, spending. McCarthy is insistent that any deal cuts spending next year. That's discretionary spending in the appropriations process, that it has to be less than current year spending. In the Limit, Save, Grow Act, they propose returning spending to fiscal year 2022 levels, which was about $130 billion cut. But at the same time, McCarthy is saying he wants to increase defense spending. He wants to preserve spending for Veterans Affairs and for Homeland Security, which is the border wall. And so to do that and to kind of also cut spending, you have to have a bigger chunk of cuts and a lot of the Democratic spending priorities on education, on healthcare, on other issues. And this is something that's anathema to Democrats, that Biden is willing to freeze spending, but he's not willing to do it at the expense of his own party's priorities. And so it seems like on the outset, this is an intractable difference that it's very hard to settle. Another issue is something like work requirements. Now, Republicans, from moderate Republicans to a lot of kind of House Freedom Caucus Republicans, are very much in support of work requirements on welfare spending. But there's an increasing adamant that Democrats say that they should not have any more work requirements. And so this, again, looks like an intractable difference. And then there's some other issues with energy permitting reform on the length of how long to raise the debt ceiling that at the surface presents a lot of challenges for the two parties. But again, I think you need that crunch time, that pressure from the markets, that pressure from like once we get even closer to the X dates, that a deal really needs to be made because the alternative is even more politically unpalatable than a compromise is on these issues.
When we're talking about politics, obviously, to politicians, optics matter. No one in leadership or who holds an office wants to go back to their base, go back to their constituents and say, hey, I was the one who compromised too much. That other side won. No one wants that for themselves or for their party. So we talked at the end of April, and you said that House Speaker Kevin McCarthy was the clear winner at that time. As you remember, he just passed the Limit, Save, Grow Act. He was the only lawmaker to have any tangible action here when it comes to the debt ceiling. So are there any winners right now, just a few weeks later?
Yeah, I think McCarthy is still in a very strong position. You just look over the past couple of weeks. Who is the one who has compromised the most? It's Democrats. Democrats were saying they would only increase the debt ceiling through a clean vote, no concessions. And here we are today. Biden and his negotiators are trying to make concessions. You saw that with kind of they're willing to freeze discretionary spending. They're willing to maybe do something on some work requirements. They are coming to the negotiating table. They are meeting McCarthy where he's at. And you're just seeing kind of in a lot of these meetings within House Republicans, these far right Republicans who were at once kind of a risk for McCarthy's job security and in like a motion to vacate are fully behind McCarthy and his negotiating position. Who has the unity right now among his party? It's McCarthy. It's not Biden. But in order to reach a deal, a compromise that can pass both the Republican-led House and the Democratic-led Senate, there needs to be compromise. And so I think it's in the coming days ahead, can McCarthy pull off a deal that has some sort of compromise? Because a deal that passes the debt ceiling that can also pass the Democrat is different than the deal that Republicans made back in April to pass the Limit Save Grow Act, which included nearly all the Republican caucus. Any future bipartisan deal is going to kind of have Democratic and Republican supports, and that's likely not going to have the support of many members of the House Freedom Caucus. And so it's this maneuver for McCarthy that will be perhaps one of his biggest challenges. And so that's why you're seeing kind of these fights right now in public where McCarthy is saying, there's some optimism, but he's also saying there's no kind of progress being made. He wants to set up a dynamic that when we reach crunch time in the coming days, that he was able to show to his conservative base that he was able to get further concessions from Democrats, even if they were more kind of not as substantial as in the Limit Save Grow Act. He's able to point to conservatives like, look, we made a deal together, and I was pushing for a lot of priorities, and I see how far Democrats have caved from no negotiating to making these concessions. And so this is kind of the delicate art of the negotiation that McCarthy is trying to go through in the days ahead.
Let's talk about what the end goal here, the end game looks like, because there needs to be a deal. It needs to be done soon. As you said, we are currently in crunch time, sitting here a week away, and both parties really seem entrenched in a stalemate without much wiggle room. So is there a win-win solution where both parties can go back to their base and say, hey, look what I did. We actually won?
Yes, there is. And I think it's one of the things in Washington, D.C., if the two sides want to get to yes, never underestimate the creativity and the budget maneuvers to make the numbers work in order for both sides to declare victory. And so what would something like that look like? So for McCarthy, he needs to show that he is cutting spending. And the Limit Save Grow Act would cut spending from to FY22 levels, which is a $130 billion reduction in current spending. But McCarthy has shown that there is some wiggle room. He has said he's been willing to use the unspent COVID aid, which is about $30 to $60 billion, depending on how you count that, as counting towards any spending reduction. There's things like the Supreme Court ruling over student loan debt forgiveness, which should come in the weeks ahead, that could once again cut some spending, hundreds of billions of dollars from kind of the current budget baseline. So there is some wiggle room for McCarthy to show that he is cutting spending in negotiating with Democrats while not adhering to the Limit Save Grow Act, kind of more draconian spending cuts on non-defense levels. Now, for Biden, his view is that he can declare victory to say that he avoided the most extreme MAGA cuts that were being proposed in the House. So if he says that we were able to kind of freeze spending, or we're able to kind of keep spending cuts moderated, he may be able to go to Democrats and say, look, this could have been much worse. We're still in a strong position. There is future ways to kind of increase spending outside of kind of the traditional budget parameters. And we've kind of resolved this overhanging issue of the debt ceiling as we head into re-election. And so it's much about kind of shifting the goalposts for Democrats and Republicans on some of these issues as kind of holding firm into kind of their entrenched talking points. And so the spending cuts and the spending caps, it's just one area where there could be some compromise.
Hopefully there is a solution, but as we sit here, I'm really not going to lie. I'm sweating, Ben, because we've been talking about this since February. It is now end of May. June is creeping up. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen once again said that the beginning of June is the hard deadline before the U.S. simply can't pay its bills. So can you spell out just how bad it is if we reach that deadline, if we surpass it and no deal's made?
Yeah, it is nerve-wracking, but that may be a function of the negotiations, that you need that nerve-wracking sense. You need that worries from the market in order to push the two sides to reaching a deal, in order to make it palatable for some of these rank and file members, for both Republicans and Democrats, to say, okay, we will swallow a compromise here, even if we don't kind of like the details. But it is true that back in 2011, a deal wasn't reached on the debt ceiling until 2 days before the X date. And we saw kind of the markets really respond before and also after that. And if we do get to this point that we reach the X date and no deal is reached, it's kind of calamitous. And there's a lot of uncertainty. We don't know the extent of how the markets will react, how investors will react, how retirement savers will react, how the economy will be impacted. But there's a lot of doom and gloom out there. And if we do reach that X date, here's the question is, does the Treasury, do they prioritize debt payments so that they still will get some revenue coming in from tax payments, but won't be able to pay all of their bills, but maybe they will prioritize things like interest and debt payments that will perhaps stave off a technical default, but won't stave off a lot of uncertainties of the reliability of treasuries and a lot of steep spending cuts within the government. And so I think a lot of this is theoretical, even if we're just a few short days from the debt ceiling. But I'd expect in the days to come, if the two sides still aren't really reaching a deal, that the pressure will mount, seriously mount. And I think will kind of be a do or die time, like we saw in 2011, for something to happen, something to be reached, whether it's a short-term punt, whether it's the Treasury saying we're going to prioritize some of these debt payments, something to help try to cause some sort of action. But I think this nervousness and sweating the X date is a function of the negotiations rather than an effect of it in order to reach a deal.
You used phrases like doom and gloom, do or die. I mean, you really can't overstate the seriousness of what we're discussing. And hopefully the next time I'm talking to you, it's about the solution that lawmakers have reached here. But in the meantime, Ben Koltun, thank you so much for the update.
Thanks, Brittany. Happy to be here.